Hello! I'm going to unpack my heritage and what that means for my future as a teacher. I gathered this information from my own experiences, my family, and our books. Yes, I come from a family that keeps books. That alone says something. With almost everything I've learned about my family, I have had to avoid the Harry Potter-like conundrum of looking into my family's history, and thus my own, like the Mirror of Erised. For those of you who have avoided H.P. Love and J.K. Rowling's craft, that's a mirror which shows your utmost desires instead of what's really there. My point is, it would be nice to see my earliest traceable ancestor as the guy whose land was taken away by General George Washington, but he's actually the guy who took that land from indigenous people in the first place. To complicate things, my grandmother was told by both sides of her family that we have native blood, and though they couldn't prove it, she should, quote, accept it, as if it was something hard to digest. I also want to think of that earlier ancestor and his move from Kentucky because he, quote, didn't like the slavery issues, to at least be passive abolitionism, but that's not a thing. It's like when so many people today racially segregate themselves to try to run away from, quote, the race problem, and their responsibility in creating and maintaining white dominant culture. On the same side of the family, I come from a long line of educators. My great-grandmother taught English and biology, just like I will, and she did so to help foster girls in high school who had been labeled as troublemakers. She was pretty cool. But what do you get when you add together the fact that my family took land from Native Americans, maintained racism by allowing it to go unchecked, and for generations teaching in the education system? You get the very systemic racism that plagues our schools today. That is all of our heritage, but it is especially mine to grapple with and change in order to promote social justice. Whew, okay, that's just my dad's side of things. Actually, my dad's mom's side of things, because my grandma is my biological grandmother, but my grandpa adopted him. Divorce Kid 101, compartmentalize. So, on my mom's side, I'm second-ish generation because my French grandmother never stopped being French. When I think about her, I'm amazed at how, even though she died when we were both way too young, she is a big part of my identity. I remember practicing my handwriting so that it would be like hers, and I still write like her. I didn't realize until my junior year of college, just prior to a trip where I would visit my French family, just how much I missed her without ever having truly known her. My professor simply asked the class to write why we had signed up for her French history and literature course. The words I wrote on the page spelled out that I had chosen to educate myself about France and taken years of French classes because I wanted to get to know my grandmother. This was huge for me. All it took for me to realize this little something about myself that was monumental was a warm-up assignment the first day of class. That's the power of teaching. What I didn't realize yet, and I do now, is that I wanted to reclaim my heritage. I wanted to know my grandmother in order to know myself. That's a big part of why we learn anything as adolescents and young adults. We learn an instrument to know what kind of music we're capable of. We learn to read in order to expand our world. Everything we learn has the potential to allow us to further discover ourselves. So as I talked to my paternal grandparents and emailed back and forth with my mom about an army brat childhood she'd sooner forget, I found myself thinking about the education I received and the one I plan to give. I remembered a Macintosh-like list of privileges that I could count on my teachers looking like me and my family, for one. I remembered that teachers who chose to implement marginalized perspectives stuck out like sore thumbs, like my 7th grade history teacher, who taught us New Mexican history from the Acoma tribe's perspective. At the same time, my schools were named after the Spanish conquistadores, and the Albuquerque baseball team was called the Dukes after them. If you've read Sherman Alexie, you know that mascots matter, especially when they teach that rapacious colonialists are heroes and that indigenous people are less than. I also remember freely choosing which track I wanted to be in for which subject. Spoiler alert, I focused on English and bio. But I also remembered my sister being violently bullied, and how that, as well as some other issues at home, led to her dropping out of school. And I remembered not being myself, because I was terrified to be. But I wasn't afraid to be a, quote, good daughter, or a good student, even when that meant losing a part of myself that took years and heartbreak to rediscover. I had to unlearn what school, society, and even my family had taught me. So I guess as I reflect on my own education and my family history, I've discovered that social justice and injustice is part of everyone's lives. And yes, education teaches us about ourselves, but that isn't always the outcome. Often, schools are set up so that we unlearn things about ourselves. It will be my job not to teach my students who they are, but to let them teach me. Equally important, I can promote social justice and change as my students navigate that journey. That's my goal, that students will walk away from my classroom not only knowing material that will help them succeed, but also knowing more about themselves and others so that they can be social justice advocates too. Thank you, and thank you to my sources for fair use of their material.